In the mid-1800s, Japan was a quiet island nation, isolated from the rest of the world for more than 2 centuries. Its technology was old, its military was traditional, and its economy was small. No one could have imagined that within just a few decades, this nation would transform into one of the most powerful empires in the world. This transformation began in 1868, with an event known as the Meiji Restoration. Japan's leaders realized a harsh truth. If they did not modernize, they would be conquered, just like many Asian countries under Western control. So Japan made a bold decision. It would learn from the West, and then become strong enough to challenge it. Factories rose across the country. Railways, steel industries, and shipyards expanded at a speed no one expected. Young students were sent to Europe and America to learn modern science, engineering, and military tactics. Foreign experts were brought to Japan to help reshape the nation's schools, laws, and industries. In just 30 years, Japan built a modern army and navy. Their rapid progress shocked the world when they defeated China in 1895, and shocked it again even more when they defeated Russia, European superpower, in 1905. It was the first time an Asian nation defeated a major Western empire in modern warfare. Japan became confident. Japan became ambitious. Japan became powerful. By the 1930s, Japan no longer saw itself as a small island nation. It saw itself as the leader of Asia, a rising force destined to shape the future of the Pacific. The government encouraged nationalism. Schools taught children loyalty to the emperor. Factories worked day and night to produce weapons, ships, and planes. Japan believed it had a mission: to create a vast empire that stretched across Asia. This new Japan was modern, industrial, disciplined, and ready for war. Its leaders felt unstoppable, convinced that their military strength, advanced technology, and national unity made them superior to their enemies. The world was about to learn how powerful Japan had become. And this, by the time the world approached the 1930s, Japan had built something far more advanced than just factories and cities. It had created a military machine, highly disciplined, deeply motivated, and ready to expand the empire. This army and navy were not just strong. They were shaped by an intense belief that Japan was destined to rule Asia. At the heart of this military power was the Imperial Japanese Army. Its soldiers were trained under extreme discipline. From a young age, recruits were taught endurance, loyalty, and absolute obedience. Harsh training was considered normal. Pain was a lesson, sacrifice was an honor, and dying for the emperor was the highest duty. Japanese officers believed that toughness was more important than comfort. New soldiers marched for hours with little rest, carried heavy loads across mountains, and learned to survive with minimal food. These methods created troops who did not fear hardship and rarely surrendered. But on the seas, Japan's strength grew even more. The Imperial Japanese Navy became one of the most advanced naval forces in the world. In world capitals, military planners watched Japan's rising power with surprising concern. Japan invested heavily in new warships, submarines, and state-of-the-art aircraft carriers. They pushed technology forward, building fast, powerful ships with long-range torpedoes that outperformed many Western designs. Their pilots trained relentlessly. Flying was dangerous, yet thousands of young men volunteered, dreaming of honor and glory in the skies. By the late 1930s, Japan had one of the best naval aviation programs on the planet. Behind this massive force were armories, factories, and shipyards working day and night. Japan's industry was organized with military precision. Every part of the nation's schools, businesses, farmers, workers was encouraged to support the war effort. The government controlled information, inspired patriotism, and promoted the idea that Japan's destiny depended on every citizen. This unity allowed Japan to build planes, tanks, and ships at an impressive speed, even without the huge natural resources that other nations had. Japan also invested heavily in intelligence and strategic planning. Their military leaders studied enemy weaknesses, experimented with new tactics, and prepared for war long before it began. They understood that Japan's strength depended on striking fast, hitting hard, and finishing battles before larger nations could react. By 1941, Japan had shaped itself into a fearsome war machine, one that blended ancient warrior discipline with modern industrial power. It was ready to take on anyone who stood in its way. And soon, the world would witness this power in action. By the early 1940s, Japan commanded one of the most advanced navies on Earth. For years, its leaders had studied the oceans, knowing that the future of war would not be decided only on land, but across the vast waters of the Pacific. And so Japan invested heavily, quietly, carefully, and strategically in building a navy unlike anything the world had seen before. At the center of this power were aircraft carriers. Japan's military was among the first to realize that battleships, once symbols of naval dominance, were no longer the future. Instead, control of the sky would decide victory at sea. So Japan built carriers fast, powerful, and capable of launching dozens of aircraft in minutes. Ships like the Akagi Kaga and Zuikaku became floating air bases, each one carrying skilled pilots, trained for precision strikes. These carriers were not only machines, they were symbols of a new era of naval warfare. Supporting the carriers were warships just as deadly, cruisers packed with guns, destroyers armed with long-range torpedoes, and submarines that stalked the Pacific's dark waters. Japan's famous Type 93 Long Lance torpedo could travel farther and hit harder than any other torpedo in the world. It gave Japanese ships a terrifying night battle advantage. But Japan's greatest strength wasn't only its ships, it was its strategy. Japanese naval planners believed in striking first, striking fast, and crippling the enemy before they could fight back. This idea shaped every plan, every ship design, every training exercise. Pilots practiced coordinated attacks again and again, learning to launch in tight formations, dive with accuracy, and return with discipline. Japan's carriers could move silently across the ocean, hidden by distance and darkness. Then, with perfect timing, they could unleash a wave of aircraft powerful enough to devastate entire fleets. This strategy shocked the world on December 7, 1941, when Japanese planes roared over Pearl Harbor. The precision, speed, and coordination of the attack showed how advanced Japan's naval aviation truly was. In just a few hours, the U.S. Pacific Fleet was crippled. Japan repeated this success across Asia and the Pacific, striking at Hong Kong, Malaya, Wake Island, and the Philippines. Every attack was planned with detail, every move backed by years of preparation. By early 1942, Japan's navy ruled the Pacific with confidence. Its carriers dominated the skies. Its ships commanded the seas. And its strategy seemed unstoppable. But this power came with limits that Japan did not yet see. And soon, those limits would shape the fate of the entire war. The power of Japan's military strategy. When the world stepped into the dark era of the 1930s and 1940s, Japan entered it with a military strategy unlike any other major power. What truly made Japan dangerous was not only its weapons or soldiers, but its mindset and planning. This chapter explores how Japan's strategy turned it into one of the most powerful forces of World War II. Japan's military leaders believed in one core idea: strike first, strike fast, and strike with overwhelming force. This belief shaped the way Japan fought every battle. From China to the Pacific Islands, Japan understood that it could not win a long war against giants like the United States. So, instead of waiting, Japan built a strategy based on speed and surprise. They aimed to disable the enemy before the enemy even knew what had happened. The attack on Pearl Harbor is the most famous example, but it wasn't the only one. Japan carried out dozens of rapid strikes across Southeast Asia in just months. capturing territories like the Philippines, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Malaya with shocking speed. Another key element was Japan's Bushido-inspired military doctrine. Soldiers were trained to fight with extreme discipline and loyalty. Retreat was considered shameful. Surrender was unacceptable. This created armies that would fight to the last man, making Japanese defenses some of the toughest in the war. At places like Iwo Jima and Okinawa, Japanese soldiers turned mountains and caves into deadly fortresses, forcing Allied troops to fight for every inch. Japan also developed an unusual tactic: decisive naval battles. Instead of spreading their forces, Japanese commanders wanted one giant, spectacular battle that would destroy the enemy completely. This philosophy pushed Japan to build massive battleships, like the Yamato and Musashi floating fortresses meant to dominate the Pacific. Though these ships ultimately failed, they reflected Japan's bold and aggressive military style. But perhaps the strongest part of Japan's strategy was its coordination. The Japanese army and navy worked together in a synchronized way to capture resources and territory. They didn't just attack blindly, they hit ports, airfields, supply routes, and communication hubs. Every move was planned to weaken the enemy's ability to fight back. Japan's military strategy was powerful because it mixed fearlessness, speed, and precision. It shocked the world and helped Japan build an empire that stretched thousands of miles. But this aggressive strategy also had a weakness: it relied on quick victories. When Japan began losing momentum, the same risky tactics that brought it success became Japan's industrial power and wartime production. Behind every powerful army lies a strong industrial engine, and Japan understood this better than most nations of the early 20th century. While Japan was smaller and had fewer natural resources compared to giants like the United States or the Soviet Union, it built a wartime industry that was efficient, ambitious, and shockingly effective. Japan's rise began decades before World War II. During the Meiji Restoration, Japan rapidly modernized its factories, shipyards, and railways. By the 1930s, this foundation allowed the empire to shift quickly into full-scale war production. Factories once used for commercial goods transformed into hubs for building tanks, planes, and warships. One of Japan's greatest strengths was its ability to maximize limited resources. Since Japan lacked oil, steel, and rubber, it turned to innovation and careful engineering. Japanese aircraft designers created planes like the Mitsubishi A6M0, built with lightweight materials that gave it superior maneuverability and long range. The Zero became a symbol of Japan's industrial fast and ahead of its time during the early years of the war. Japan also became a powerhouse in naval construction. Massive shipyards in Kure and Yokosuka produced destroyers, submarines, and aircraft carriers at a remarkable pace. The crown jewels were the Yamato-class battleships, the largest ever built. These ships were engineering marvels, anachronisms in some ways, but proof of Japan's industrial ambition. Yet, industry wasn't just about machines. Japan depended heavily on human labor. Millions of workers, men, women, and students were mobilized into the workforce. Factories ran day and night, turning out ammunition, rifles, torpedoes, and military vehicles. Even small workshops contributed by producing spare parts and components. Japan's industrial strategy also extended far beyond its borders. As its empire expanded, Japan seized resource-rich territories such as Manchuria, the Dutch East Indies, and parts of Southeast Asia. These regions supplied iron or coal, food, and most importantly, oil. Japanese planners believed control of these resources would ensure victory and independence from Western powers. But this strategy had a critical flaw. Japan's industry was powerful, but not limitless. It could not match the massive production capacity of the United States, which had far more factories, workers, and raw materials. By 1943, Japan's industrial advantage began to crumble. Under the weight of American production, battleships were sunk faster than they could be replaced. Aircraft shortages grew severe. Fuel supplies dwindled. Still, Japan's wartime industry remains one of the most impressive achievements in military history, a story of engineering brilliance, determination, and the drive to compete with the world's strongest powers. Japan's early victories in World War II did not happen by accident. They were the result of careful planning, precise timing, and a military strategy that unfolded like a series of lightning strikes. Across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, for a brief moment, Japan seemed unstoppable, defeating larger nations with speed and coordination that shocked the world. Japanese strategists understood that they could not win a long war against Western powers. Their only chance was to win fast, hit hard, and destroy enemy forces before they had a chance to respond. This idea became the heart of Japan's early war strategy. The first major strike came on December 7, 1941, when Japan launched its attack on Pearl Harbor. While the world remembers the devastation, few realize how complex the planning was behind it. 6 aircraft carriers traveled across the Pacific in total secrecy. Hundreds of Japanese pilots trained for months, rehearsing torpedo runs, bomb patterns, and attack formations. Their mission was simple: cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet in a single blow. Japan's military planners believed that if America's battleships and aircraft were destroyed early, the U.S. would lose the will to fight. At the same time, Japanese forces launched coordinated strikes across Asia and the Pacific. Guam, Hong Kong, Malaya, the Philippines, and Wake Island all came under attack. Within hours of Pearl Harbor, an unprecedented show of military synchronization, but Japan's strategy went deeper than rapid attacks. It relied heavily on surprise, mobility, and dominance of the air and sea. Japanese forces moved quickly, often overwhelming defenders before they could organize resistance. The Imperial Navy's carriers allowed Japan to project power across thousands of miles, striking enemies who believed they were out of reach. On the ground, Japanese troops demonstrated a combination of discipline, training, and aggressive tactics. They moved through dense jungles, crossed mountains, and launched night assaults that caught Allied forces off guard. Their capture of to be an unbreakable fortress shocked the British Empire. The fall of the Philippines forced the United States into one of its most painful wartime defeats. Japan's early success also depended on intelligence and deception. They disguised fleets, used coded messages, and created confusion among their enemies. Japanese commanders anticipated how Western militaries would respond and designed operations to exploit those weaknesses. However, beneath all this success lay a dangerous assumption that early victories would force the Allies into negotiation. Japan's early war strategy remains one of the most impressive examples of military planning in history, bold and devastating. But it was also a strategy built on risk, and eventually, the limits of Japanese power, weaknesses that changed the war. Japan's rise during the early years of World War II made the empire appear unstoppable. Its armies swept across Asia, its navy dominated the Pacific, and its aircraft ruled the skies. But beneath this image of strength were critical weaknesses that would slowly unravel. Japan's wartime success. Understanding these flaws reveals why Japan could win battles, but not the war. Japan's most significant limitation was resources. The empire lacked vital raw materials such as oil, steel, aluminum, and rubber. These were the lifeblood of modern warfare. Japan imported more than 90% of its oil before the war. And when the United States imposed embargoes, Japan faced a crisis. Without oil, ships could not sail, planes could not fly, and factories could not run. The decision to expand into Southeast Asia was driven by desperate capture the oil, Dutch East Indies, and secure fuel for the war machine. But capturing resources was only half the problem. Transporting them back to Japan required ships, As the war progressed, the U.S. Navy began sinking Japanese merchant vessels at an alarming rate. By 1944, Japan had lost half its transport fleet. The empire could extract resources from its occupied territories, but it could no longer bring them home. Another major weakness was industry. Japan had strong factories, but nowhere near the scale of the United States. While Japan struggled to build a few dozen ships per year, the US launched more than one ship every day. American aircraft factories produced thousands of planes monthly, overwhelming Japan's smaller industrial output. No matter how skilled Japanese engineers were, they could not compete with America's industrial giant. Japan also faced limitations in technology development. Early in the war, Japanese aircraft, especially the Zero, were among the best in the world. But, as years passed, Japan failed to upgrade its designs. The United States introduced newer, faster, and stronger aircraft, like the Hellcat, Corsair, and B-29 Super. Japan simply lacked the resources and time to match these advancements. Logistics presented another challenge. Japan's empire stretched thousands of miles across the Pacific and Asia, supplying distant garrisons became nearly impossible as the tide of war shifted. Many Japanese soldiers fought without food, ammunition, or reinforcements. Entire units were isolated, left to survive on small islands where starvation and disease became more deadly than enemy bullets. Leadership also contributed to Japan's struggle. Japan's early victories had been impressive, but they masked these deep vulnerabilities. Once the Allies understood Japan's weaknesses: limited resources, small industrial power, long supply lines, aging technology, the balance of the war shifted. And from that point onward, Japan's defeat became nearly inevitable. At the height of its power, Japan controlled a vast empire stretching from Manchuria to the Pacific Islands. But by 1943, the momentum had shifted. The same forces that once made Japan powerful were now cracking under the pressure of a global war. The collapse of the Japanese empire was not sudden, it was a slow unraveling, shaped by strategic defeats, resource exhaustion, and a determined enemy that refused to surrender. The turning point came at Midway in June 1942. In a single battle, Japan lost 4 of its frontline aircraft carriers, veteran vessels, and experienced crews that could not be replaced. This defeat shattered Japan's naval superiority. From that moment, Japan was fighting a defensive war. Soon after, the United States launched the island-hopping campaign. Instead of attacking every Japanese-held island, Allied forces targeted key strategic locations: Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Guam, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Each victory brought American forces closer to Japan's homeland, tightening the noose around the empire. Meanwhile, Japan's resource crisis grew catastrophic. Fuel shortages, grounded planes, and immobilized fleets. Factories slowed as raw materials disappeared. Soldiers at the front lines starved, their supply routes cut by relentless American submarine attacks. Japan's once navy struggled to operate as ships, remained tied to port with empty fuel tanks. At the same time, U.S. air power grew overwhelming. American B-29 bombers launched massive air raids on Japan's industrial centers. Cities like Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya were reduced to ruins. In one night, the Tokyo firebombing of March 1945, over 100,000 civilians were killed. Japan's industry was crippled beyond repair. Despite this devastation, Japan's leaders refused to surrender. The military clung to the Bushido ideal of honor and sacrifice, even as defeat became inevitable. Japan prepared its people for a last-stand defense of the homeland. Schoolchildren trained with bamboo spears. Civilians dug trenches and shelters. The empire hoped to make the cost of invasion so high that the Allies would negotiate. But history took a different path. In August 1945, the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, entire cities in seconds. For the first time, Japan confronted a weapon beyond imagination. And as the shock of the atomic bombings spread, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan, launching a massive invasion of Manchuria. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed the nation for the first time in history. His voice, calm yet heavy with defeat, declared that Japan must endure the unendurable. The war was over. The empire had fallen. Japan's collapse marked the end of an era, dramatic conclusion to its rise as a regional power, but it also marked the beginning of a new chapter, one that would lead to peace, reconstruction, and eventually, Japan's emergence as